Good evening, everyone. Just checking that this is working and you can hear me okay. I think you can. So, welcome to the Regent Cinema, the oldest cinema in London and part of the University of Westminster. I'm Nat Campbell, and I'm the Chancellor of this fine establishment. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Wollstonecraft Society annual conversation about human rights, equality, and justice for all. These three principles are at the heart of everything we do at the University of Westminster, which is why why we're delighted to host you for the first time. The first of many, I'm sure. I hope you enjoy your evening. I'm keeping it very brief because you're not here to see me. I can't wait to hear the conversation that we're going to have. So with that, I will hand over to you, Bea.
Oh, wow, Natalie Campbell, Chancellor of the University of Westminster, thank you. Westminster has been so supportive of the Wollstonecraft Society's human rights work. And when you find out that this was the first polytechnic in London set up to educate working people, it kind of makes sense. Thanks also to Lynn Berry, to Peter Bonfield, to Paula Cadenhead and Sevgi Sarialtin. I'm Bea Rowlatt and I'm chair of the Wollstonecraft Society. Some of you might know that I love talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, maybe a little bit too much, but there is just so much to enjoy. Trust me, she's addictive. She was, of course, not just one of the first feminists in the English language, but she was an early architect of what we now call human rights. The scope of her intellect is matched by her astonishing life. She was a genius, but she was very much in the world. As a visionary philosopher, educator, abolitionist, pioneer, brilliant writer, loud campaigner, passionate lover, fearless traveller. Why isn't she more famous? Well, we're working on that, but it's not enough that people know her name. It's about drawing inspiration from her courage and from her legacy and bringing that into the world now. And that is what we do, because I don't know if you've spotted, but we're not living in the most optimistic of times. I'm not going to name all of the horrors, but we're tackling some of them tonight. Wollstonecraft would not stand for it, and neither should we. So I want to remind you that there is a counter-narrative to what we see on the news. The Wollstonecraft Society is a human rights sunbeam in dark times. Why? Because we've had a substantial growth spurt lately, and thanks to our brilliant manager, Emma Waslin, we are now running multiple projects in and around Hull and the East Riding, soon to be rolled out elsewhere, inspiring young people and school children about their human rights and how that can play a role within their own communities. We've partnered with museums, libraries, theatre groups, mental health charities and schools. And just between January and March of this year, we've engaged with 1,215 young people and children. Yes. Over half of whom are facing barriers such as living in care and or mental health or poverty-related issues, to which Wollstonecraft herself was no stranger. We've got lots of great friends and supporters, but we want more. So follow us, sign up to our newsletter, especially all our friends joining us online. Share us with your friends and support us however you can. After the event, some of you here in person may be gently accosted by several children. They're mine. They're here under strict orders to gather supporters, so please oblige. You could even buy a strictly limited edition, numbered and signed Stewie print. These are really special. And it was Wollstonecraft's birthday yesterday, so either treat yourself on her behalf or buy it for someone you love. Okay, it's time now for the main event, the Wollstonecraft Society lecture. Is different every year. We really do spoil you. This one feels so very timely. Please allow me to go wild with excitement at the prospect of Laura Bates' new book out any minute now, and Gemma Cairney, fresh off the nation's airwaves. Huge applause. Welcome both.
Hello, how is everyone? Oh, my heart feels things. sometimes I'm like, is this nerves or is it just care? Like, do I care? Yes, I care. And I'm speaking to Laura Bates. Round of applause for Laura. I also want to big up B. I met B at Glastonbury when I had managed to somehow get a double-decker yellow bus called Dandelion on the ground in the Greenpeace fields, and just sort of got to program my own festival on a bus in the festival of my dreams. And somebody introduced me to B, and then I heard all about Mary. And I fell in love with Mary. And I'm writing a book that's taken me 6 years or something ridiculous, and Mary's in it now because of you, so thank you. Okay, I know we've got some serious stuff to tackle, and that's the stuff that makes my heart go, ooh, because I really feel it. I really feel in these times, in this moment, on today, here in our capital city in London, amongst like minds or open minds, we have a crisis, and we've invited people to think with us, talk with us, converse with us, to try and find ways to not only tackle a crisis, but perhaps be a realist about the fact that it's happening. Because it's quite easy, isn't it, I think, in our modern times to feel a bit overwhelmed. And I'm interested to kick off the conversation with you, Laura, as such a smart thinker. Where are we at when it comes to human rights and equality? How bad are things? Are they as bad as it seems when we're doom scrolling?
I think things are bad. I think we need to pay attention to that because, as you say, it's easy to become overwhelmed. I think we're in the midst of a number of intersecting crises, and it's easy to focus on one and to lose sight of the others, and I think that's important. I think it's a complex picture. I think there's a huge amount of hope out there. There's a huge amount of fight back, of resistance, of incredible people doing incredible things. None of these things are as simple and unnuanced, I think, as the media and a social media would like us to think. And there is hope, but it's an emergency. We don't use that word. We don't use the word public health crisis. It's a public health crisis when we think about the realities of particularly male violence, I would say. It's a public health crisis that in this week we've seen the 5th woman to be either murdered or seriously injured by a misogynistic man with a crossbow, and for it to be described as an isolated incident in less than a year. In a situation where, on average, every 3 days, a woman is murdered by a man, but it's still described as an isolated incident, where, on average, 1 rape per day of the school term is being reported to police by schools across the UK, and they're described as isolated incidents. We don't consider this to be a national emergency. What could be more urgent than this? This is a crisis, it's an emergency, but it isn't one that we see because we're used to it. So I think it is an emergency, it is a moment of real peril, and recognizing that is vital, but also holding on to hope and recognizing it doesn't mean that we're powerless to acknowledge that. It means we're at the start, and there is so much we can do once we see it.
Thank you, and I think that it's really important to feel emboldened to come and look in each other's eyes in reality, listen to live conversation, be next to one another in real human spaces, in public spaces, because I think that a lot of this information is being given to us when we are on our phones and often alone. And I think that can be so paralyzing with how scary it feels.
Yeah, and I think that paralysis works in favour of the status quo. When we feel that things are hopeless, when we don't feel that we have it in our gift to act, we inadvertently maintain the status quo in that paralysis. So I think sometimes there is a sense that in order to act, it has to be something huge. And I mean this on a whole load of different levels. If you're a man, this idea that to be an ally means kind of signing up to something terrifying and weighty, that you have to be somehow kind of punching out other men who've done something wrong. If you want to be an activist, you have to be kind of going on marches and waving banners and shouting through a loudspeaker. If you're a parent and you want to tackle issues around misogynistic radicalization with your child, that it's going to mean a huge and terrifying seismic conversation that neither of you will ever really recover from. And in every one of those instances, and so many more, you can start small. And the starting is the hardest part, and then it builds from there. So it's not about one big terrifying conversation with your child. It's about the tiny things that you do every single day to open up those possibilities, to give them the sense that none of this is inevitable, that gender stereotypes aren't immutable, and that you can resist. It isn't about the man who is punching out the guy being misogynistic. It's about the guy who is quietly asking what his shared parental leave policies are at work, because that's a conversation that women are otherwise bearing the brunt of. It's not necessarily just about waving banners and going on marches, although that is hugely important. It's about those smaller, quieter moments of activism and resistance within our immediate communities, and that can, when we put them all together, build this huge, incredible mosaic of resistance. And there's really deep power in that, I think, if you see the value of connecting and of community-led action.
And I think also it's about holding up a mirror to our own selves. I think this localized idea is really rousing and exciting, but being hyper-focused on what it is that we are as individuals in a collective are consuming. Like, how do we feel about ourselves? Does, like, the inner misogynist exist in our own sphere? Mm-hmm. You know, what are we reading, and who do we hope is cool in our peers, you know, that we're trying to impress? And I think that that's a really important audit, and one that I think has to be done quite regularly, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very easy for us to feel that power we have as consumers, as members of societies and members of our community isn't there. But the reality is that if we reclaim that sense of power for ourselves in terms of consumption, in terms of where we put our money, in terms of, you know, which organizations we're supporting, but also as a group, you know, as a collective, saying, you know, we are a group of 10 parents, we can make a difference in this particular situation with this problem that we're having at the local school or whatever it is, then there is power in that. But I also think it is so important that we, alongside that, are demanding systemic change, institutional shift that goes far beyond lip service, far beyond suggesting that, oh, just screening a TV show in a school is going to fix this problem. You know, that people in positions of power are being held to account. Okay, you say you're shocked, you say you're devastated to hear about this, so what are you going to do about it? What are you going to change? What are you going to be prepared to reform within the fabric of these institutions, where it isn't an exaggeration to say that institutionalized misogyny and racism are preventing entire communities from accessing justice, from having equal access to education, equal access to healthcare, to financial services. There are some really deep elements of reform that I think we really need to also collectively demand from those gatekeepers who too often get away with pointing back to the grassroots changes that need to happen.
It's sometimes really hard for me, despite the rage that I try to transmute regularly, to find the direct sort of calm and deemably sophisticated enough action, because I know that I can easily be put in the bracket of the angry black woman. And that's something that I struggle with regularly. And I think that it does matter how we present to the rest of the world when it comes to taking action. It makes a difference.
Yeah, it does, and that is absolutely maddening, because we have every right to be angry, and because there is such good reason to be angry, and because women's rage, which has been stigmatized for so long, holds such power. And actually, there were 3 incredible books about this that were published recently. Apparently, they're like buses, books about women's rage. 3 come along at once. There's one, by Rebecca Traister. There's one by Soraya Shamali. Rage Becomes Her. Good and Mad, I think, is the the Rebecca Traister book, and the other is by Brittany Cooper. And all of them are just brilliant, and I think worth consuming, and it is worth us saying. We're furious, we're angry, and we have every right to be angry, and that might feel untamable and scary. But I think this is where we also need allyship, because, as you said, there are multiple intersecting forms of abuse and of prejudice that react to our anger in particular ways. And I actually think one of the best examples of this is Andy Murray, who, whenever in an interview someone asks him how it feels to be the first player to have, whatever it is, won so many Grand Slams in a row, will just quietly, not demonstrably, just kind of very politely say, actually, Venus and Serena Williams both did it first. And it's not a big deal when he does it. You know, it's not asking the world of him. But if one of those women were to interrupt an interviewer and say, actually, you know, which is absolutely their right, and they should be angry, but they would be put in that bracket that you described. They'd be seen as difficult. They'd be seen as irascible. They'd be seen as angry black women who were, you know, overly inflated with their own success. All of those stereotypes. So it seems like a simple thing that we're asking of male allies, but it is taking away that huge kind of burden. They can disrupt that normalization in a way that others can't, and that's really important.
And maybe that's a moment to say how important men are in this challenge, how important we all are, regardless of our pronouns. This is something that's about human rights.
Absolutely, and that affects us all. One of the most effective kind of twists that we've seen in the narrative of this conversation in recent years has been this increasing online polarization that is convincing us that this is a gender war. It's a battle of the sexes. It's men against women, convincing young men in particular that feminism is the enemy. It's out to destroy them. It's out to take away their, you know, hard-earned entitlement to their rights and to a particular lifestyle and to women and to money and all of this stuff. And that this is about supporting women at the expense of men. It's about taking stuff away from men to unfairly give it to women. When the reality is that all of the things that we are talking about would be beneficial across society, and particularly for men as a group where, if we look at the leading killer of that group under the age of 50 in this country, it's suicide. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that we know why that's happening. It's not a coincidence. It's not happening in a vacuum. It's not a mystery why that level is so much higher than it is for women. It is because men are dramatically less likely to access mental health support, professional support when they are in crisis. It starts really young, even by the time that you reach university, and of course here we are in this amazing setting supported by the university. By the time they reach university, fewer than a third of the counselling services that are accessed by students are accessed by male students. And we have really good research about why that is happening as well. It's not a mystery. The American Psychological Association has linked it directly to childhood gender stereotypes, to the idea, boys don't cry, men are tough and manly, don't be vulnerable, don't talk about your feelings. If you do, you're liable to experience bullying and to be excluded. And so what we know for a fact is that challenging those stereotypes, those rigid gender roles, will be transformative for men and boys, specifically around the most pressing issues that are affecting them. So it's incredibly frustrating, this idea that we are attacking them, that it's about fighting them, that it's about picking a side, that you either care about one side or the other, when the reality is that the struggles we are facing are inextricably interwoven.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we're here, you know, with the tagline challenging the manosphere. Yeah. Which almost gets like a kind of laughable eye roll. There's still this idea that the manosphere is actually potentially a bit of a joke, and it's just something that we kind of got to put up with, and it's just the fact that boys will be boys. What actually is the manosphere?
So the manosphere is a term, not a particularly good term, but the term we've got that describes a kind of loose ecosystem, largely online, but also including offline groups and communities. It spans blogs, websites, members groups, online forums, various different social media platforms, and it describes a number of different communities who are united by hatred of women, by male supremacy. It is extremely closely interconnected with and overlapping with white supremacy and the far right. Those things are not separate. And it is essentially a space that is dedicated to radicalization, but it's just a kind of radicalization that we don't describe as such. When boys are drawn into this group, it's a form of grooming, but we don't describe it as grooming. And when men come out of these spaces and commit offline acts of violence, mass violence in some cases, like Jake Davison, who carried out the biggest mass shooting we've seen in the UK for 10 years in Plymouth not all that long ago, or the tragic case that we're seeing just today in the news with the man with a crossbow, what we are doing is never describing it as terrorism. We call them isolated incidents. We say that there is no wider risk to the public. We don't recognize this as a form of terrorism because of two different societal blind spots that merge. One is a racist blind spot that prevents us from acknowledging white men as terrorists. And the other is a misogynistic blind spot where we are so inured to violence against women, we are so used to men hurting and killing women, that we cannot compute the idea that this is a form of extremism. And those two blind spots are deadly, because what we are seeing is, honestly, the mass algorithmically facilitated radicalization of an entire generation of young men, almost completely under the radar, at least until very recently. But because we don't describe it as such, and because we don't call them terrorists, even though these are people who are being groomed into hatred of a specific demographic group, then they're going offline, carrying out acts of violence against that demographic group with the aim of furthering the ideology or of silencing and instilling fear in that group. All of these are definitions of terrorism. We don't describe it as such, and that prevents us from seeing it clearly. It prevents us from allocating the resources we need to be investigating the problem, to be preventing it, to be training and supporting schools and teachers to tackle it, and it prevents us from taking it seriously as it manifests, as it trickles down in society. So when we see the tiny building blocks that kind of add up to it, we brush them off and we laugh at them and we describe it as banter or just jokes, and we don't recognize this form of terrorism for what it is.
If anyone needs to have like a break or like go to the loo or have a big deep breath or a shakeout, you will not be judged. As the adjudicator, this is heavy stuff, and sometimes it's good to just like have a moment if you need it. So yeah, I found myself just like I've become very somatic in my response these days, because I feel like we do hold trauma in our bodies. And sometimes it gets as base as just remembering that music is universally powerful too, and that we need to dance, we need to come together, and that there is like a type of hope that can be found in the simplicity of arts and culture, when this kind of intense violence starts to kind of shroud every nook and cranny of our society. Is absolutely terrifying. Do you think something as straight up as addressing tech usage and phones in households is a powerful way of combating how the algorithms can start to brainwash young men?
I think it is powerful. I think it's if it's communication, then yeah. Communication is the best tool we have as parents and as members of civil society to tackle this particular form of radicalization. But I don't think necessarily that this is about preventing kids from accessing technology, because while I understand and support parents who are making that choice, it is an unfair burden that has been placed on them. It's an unfair restriction of their right to access the tools and the technology of their future workplaces that we're placing on children. And it's a complete evasion of responsibility and of transparency for these tech companies who are creating obscenely wealthy billionaire men out of absolutely deliberately pumping this sewage, directing it to young men. And I think we have to understand the sheer extent, the power of these machines to see why that's a kind of David and Goliath fight. Because these kinds of forms of backlash have always existed, right? There has always been misogyny, there has always been backlash to perceived social justice progress, but this is the first time in history when we are facing this barrier of a generation of non-digital natives parenting and educating a generation of digital natives, the culture gap that creates, but also the strength of, if you like, the steroids that have been put behind that backlash and that reaction. if you start a TikTok account today in the name of a teenage boy, it will take, now the last time I described this in an event, it was 24 minutes before the first piece of extreme misogynistic content will be promoted to that device. That study in just a few months has been replaced by another. It's now 17 minutes. So boys don't go looking for it. It's promoted to them, and that's vital for us to understand. There's nothing inherently bad or problematic or misogynistic about teenage boys. They're not the problem here. Nor are families for having the expectation that they should be allowed to enable their child to use a device without that content being deliberately funneled to them and then being made in such a way that the algorithm will suggest more and more increasingly extreme content for them to see. We are in a situation now where the content of just one extreme misogynist, Andrew Tate, alone, and he is a tiny piece of the picture, but his content for illustrative purposes on one social media platform, TikTok, alone, has been viewed over 11.4 billion times. More than the number of people on the planet. That's what we're up against. So the idea that parents who, God, are just struggling and juggling and trying so hard to protect their kids should bear responsibility for that when these companies are becoming obscenely rich off the backs of these techniques, when they absolutely have the expertise, the skill, the tools, and the necessary workforce to tackle this overnight if they wanted to me, points to tech regulation as the solution here. And we haven't done it. We've never regulated tech in a meaningful way. The Co-op Arena recently opened in Manchester. It's one of the biggest live entertainment venues in the UK now. But in the news, you might have noticed that its opening was delayed several times, and huge acts like Take That, big comedians had to cancel their shows because it hadn't yet met up with the rigorous safety standards that were required of a live entertainment venue before it could admit members of the public. If you have a multinational food conglomerate that is producing food around the world, they cannot say, well, it won't be safe at one or two of our plants, but, we've got hundreds of them. Or like a few people are going to eat our food and die, but millions of people eat it every day. So you would not have a company if that was the approach that you took to safety. But people are dying for tech. Young women and girls in particular are losing their lives because of it. And we don't regulate it in any meaningful way because we simply have abdicated the sense that there is any form of responsibility to be held by these billionaires. But it's a mirage. We absolutely could force that power to be held to account if we wanted to.
And how? Who out there, yourself most definitely, but what portals are there? What collectives, cohorts, coalitions can we join today?
Yeah, so it's not me, obviously, it's political. We need our politicians to step up to this and to say this is a challenge that we are prepared to take on. We need to see international coalitions being prepared to work across borders because this is obviously a global transnational issue. I'm not saying that it is easy or straightforward, but I am saying that it can be done. We have similar legislation on areas like fraud, for example, which is deliberately broad in order to encapsulate the fact that new and emerging forms of offences in that particular area are developing faster than the legislation can keep up. So we can look to where things have been done before. We can look to the Council of Europe, which is perhaps doing the bravest and boldest work on this. We can look at things like the Istanbul Convention and the way in which that was able to be replicated across different jurisdictions to have a kind of gold standard in terms of safety and care. But ultimately, we have to have political will. And when you look at who is standing in the Oval Office, and when you look at the fact that at the Paris Summit on AI, when they drafted a pretty broad and gentle consensus statement that, AI should be accessible and it should be fair and it should be equitable, the UK government stood alongside the US in refusing to sign it. Or when you look at the fact that Starmer has said, and the UK government has said recently, that they would be prepared to put on the table watering down elements of the Online Safety Act if that's what it takes to gain a favourable trade deal with the US, when those two things should never be on the table at the same time, again, because of who is standing in the Oval Office, we need to pay attention to the alignment of big tech and political interests, because otherwise we are never going to reach that point of having sufficient political will in place to be prepared to put that necessary regulation in place.
Thank you. I'm thinking back to something that I was watching this morning, which I do regularly, and that was Toni Morrison's speak. And it was she was being really charismatic and quite funny, and saying that in times of despair we must make the work that, you know, we feel that we need to do. We must ask the questions. It's the time where artists need to make art the most, writers need to write, activists need to act and be activated. And she was talking about how it's just so kind of simple and boring to just go for the straight up hate, you know? She said something like, I mean, it's just so easy to trample on someone's head. Like, but like, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna actually think about it and about how doing good was for her so much more of a pull in the end on thought and theory, because it was so kind of juicy and exciting and such a journey to find ways to funnel good like out of necessity. And I adore that sentiment, and I adore the kind of sexiness of revolution, and the futurism, like the sci-fi of a feminist revolution. And I often read black feminists from the civil rights movements from the sense of diaspora. I think that the black communities in the Western world and in the global north have been subjected to so much that the ways in which we have, as a diaspora, been able to innovate, invent, create, heal, it's actually endless. So I would implore, in the same way that Angela Davis, actually, when I saw her speak recently at Women of the World Festival, actually said to some prisoners that she was speaking to read black feminist literature as ways out of some of this despair. And she came back to visit some of these prisoners who were putting down a lot of crime on the fact that men had absent fathers, and she was like, read a bit more and then come talk to me. And they did, and they said, thank you so much, we just didn't know about these writers, but actually, you know, there's so much more. It's this nuance, it's this complexity. And I think some of the most vulnerable living people in our society right now, whether it's generationally or people who have completely kind of bucked the status quo to be themselves, are the people that we should be upholding as some of the most innovative, beautiful, and amazing people to be able to actually heal the world. Because we've been under such patriarchal structure, such colonial subjugation, all of us, regardless of our surname, that like we need to really mix up our resources. We really need to actually have like a confrontation with ourselves within the systems, within education, within this kind of idea that you know, an atypical brain is the only way forward and to succeed. I've sort of got to the point where I'm just like, that's a load of shit. And I feel so lucky, actually, to be, I'm a new mum, I'm 40, I've traveled the world, and I have gone against the odds, and I still continue to. I have to fight all the time to be given this platform. But I stay open and I stay learning, and I believe that it's way more to do with a sense of multiculturalism than we ever give credit for. Like, we are a global world, and we're made up of so many things, and like, we're actually wonderfully nuanced. We're actually incredibly complicated in the most incredible way. Like, the stuff is there for us to change this around. And I know that we can do better. We can do better when we come together.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and those are, just as you say, the voices that we should be most listening to. They're also the voices most silenced in intersecting ways by these
because it's powerful
global platforms. And yeah, I mean, black women have been the canaries in the coal mines, showing us the things we're about to walk into and going unheeded. Always, I mean, throughout history, but if we look at recent history, if we look at social media, black women from so early on, you know, with campaigns like Your Slip is Showing, exposed the ways in which mass harassment, mass so-called brigading attacks, astroturfing, all of these technical terms which relate to mass kind of bot accounts being used to manipulate societal perception of grassroots beliefs, in particular extreme racist and misogynistic ideas, mass harassment attacks being used to silence and terrify women, to abuse women into silence, to butter them out of public life, going completely unheeded until something like Gamergate comes along, until high-profile white women are targeted, and suddenly the world sits up and the world listens. And what we are seeing right now is exactly the same thing playing out again, with black women's voices going ignored as they warn about the dangers of AI, the dangers of the emerging technologies that are coming for us. But they are so marginalized in terms of the ways in which they are treated when they dare to speak out, in terms of the lack of support that is given to their ventures. If you look at something like Black Twitter, even, you can see that they have also led the way in showing, demonstrating how to create subversive spaces, even within the confines of those incredibly undemocratic, abusive spaces. There is so much there to learn, and yet, if we look at the women who are leading on AI, who are fighting to find ways to use this incredible, powerful, positive technology in a transformative, joyful, beneficial way, their voices aren't heard. Women are only 12% of AI researchers. When they apply for venture capital funding for AI-led projects, teams that are led by women are getting 6 times less funding than male-led teams. So everything is stacked against them, and you're right, we as individuals can play a role as far as we can in seeking out those voices and listening, because they have for so long showed us again and again that they hold the answers.
Octavia E. Butler didn't have AI, and she was predicting all of this shit. Yeah, there are pearls. There are so many pearls out there for us as we build even the imagined revolution. I really believe it. I mean, it's in disco. It's actually in disco. Like, if I had a religion, it would be disco. I am going to open up the space, and I would love to hear from some of you at some point, but please let me continue to ask questions to this incredible person. I'm wondering if you have any questions, like, for me, or any thoughts, because we've talked about quite a lot so far, and I'm just wondering, you know, whether there's anything that's been sparked in your mind.
Yeah, well, I know that you have recently undertaken an absolutely incredible creative project, which has been about bringing together some of these threads, and would love to hear a bit more about what the kind of, specifically I think about whether there is something there of equivalent power. Is there something in bringing people together in real life that we can use to take this stuff on? Have you felt that with your work recently?
Yeah, so I didn't know that I was going to be like such, I don't know, I was going to say a radical, but that's like a bit of a loaded word. But like I didn't know, I just did. I just said yes. Like I started being a presenter when I was 23 years old. And then suddenly I was ricocheting from festival to festival and meeting pop stars and having a real good time. And I realized that pop culture was actually so powerful before Instagram, which was lucky, because it meant my outfits were insane, and it doesn't matter. And I think I got to this point in my life where I've moved to Scotland. I've pivoted in a way that I now consider myself as an artist rather than just as somebody that platforms other people's art and loves to hear and be part of their process. It's also a collaborative part of my own. And I was writing a book, which comes out next March. It's nearly done, called The Immortal Sisterhood. And it's about 12 real women, in terms of women that have lived, that we know, some of which are prominent-ish figures, like Mary C. Cole. The only living woman in this earthly plane is Grace Jones, and it goes all the way back to a pharaoh who was genderless called Hatshepsut, who there many different reigns and different kingdoms tried to kind of squash her legacy by smashing up her tomb over different periods of time and thousands of years, but her legacy continues, and she was a fantastic gender-bending, architectural-loving badass. So it's really, it does span, and as I said, Mary's in there too, and there's an ancient Chinese mathematician who also wrote poetry, and it became about creating a sisterhood that has given me strength when I've needed it. I have a real life one in my peers and almost a chosen family, and I realized in the writing that I don't get that from my direct maternal line, so I've probably been seeking this kind of depth of support and love and like needing a role model. So it's part biog, part memoir, and it's become really witchy because it's been happening for a long time now. Like I said, I was writing it in the pandemic. I lost a friend to suicide, who is a very famous person. Caroline Flack was a very good friend of mine. And it just changed. Everything changed. Everything became really felt and subliminal rather than intellectual. So it became more poetry. I was like, I'm a Rasta beat poet. I didn't even know. R.I.P. Benjamin Zephaniah, another great feminist there. Just suddenly thought about him because I love him. And these women were coming to me in my dreams, and there would just be these threads, these interconnections. Like I wrote about Marsha P. Johnson, and I thought about there's a beautiful picture of Marsha wearing a baby's breath flower as a crown. And then I thought about Minnie Riperton, who might have bumped into Marsha, you know, in downtown New York in the mid-'70s, and she sort of, not necessarily copied, but took inspiration from the queen of the streets. And I just realized that women's choices, they've never been quite documented in the way that they are now, and that we are in a time where we kind of want to know about the greats, but we also can be quite voyeuristic, and we focus on the tragedy and the trauma and the mistakes, and I wanted to focus on the overcomings and the complexity and the duality that we all have within us. So it was more than a book, because I started hearing things and moving, and I created an opera with some of the best artists that I know. So we have 2 opera singers, a choreographer or a movement director. Myself ended up in it, did not expect that. I haven't performed since I was 18 in that kind of capacity. And a live cellist. And the Immortal Sisterhood live premiered in New York City 3 days before the inauguration, where, you know, everybody had been told that a black woman isn't allowed to have power. And we had a black-led, very mixed, it's very mixed, like 2 of my ensemble are non-binary, and we're from everywhere. There's, our lineage is very beautifully expansive. And it's been life-changing. The book comes out next year. The Scottish premiere will happen on the Isle of Mull on the 1st of August. And the reason why it's become so abstract and woo-woo and avant-garde is because that, to me, is a really special way of being able to process this emergency and being able to be in amongst a collective of just vocals, of arias, of people singing, and storytelling in the way that many of our ancestors did, regardless of where our ancestors are from, was freeing and soothing and healing. And it was for all ages and for all languages, because we were creating a new language in that space, and we continue to do so. And I think that reading and like immersing oneself in an art, whether it's going to see your local theatre and not like picking up your phone for those 2 hours. I mean, I feel the same about the sea. I love cold water swimming, so I have a deep romantic relationship with water. But that's because I like to immerse, and I like to exhale, and I like to scream and move through some of the tragedy. And I never knew that that was radical until now. But I would invite everybody to create their own sisterhood, whatever that looks like to them, and to remember that the feeling of sisterhood and collective and togetherness and liveness is 100% immortal. No one can crossbow that away. Like, no bad press can diminish the power of being alive and the decisions that we make and how powerful women are. I really believe that. Yeah. So don't forget the power of the arts within the culture, because otherwise the rage can get a bit, perhaps, the better of us at points.
Yeah. And also I think the idea of sharing community and inspiration and what sparks you, which isn't happening online. We think it's happening online because our scrolling screens give us the illusion that we're moving from one thing to another thing, but none of it is actually what is sparking us or what we are choosing. And I think that those moments where somebody makes you think differently and where we can learn collective techniques of resistance in real life away from our screens are so powerful. I had an experience where I went to speak at a school in Oxfordshire, and I was speaking to it was an all-girls school, but there was an all-boys school next door, and they often joined together for certain kind of big events, or they did shows together and that kind of thing. And this was one of the events that they were joining together for. And when I got there, one of the girls told me that on social media that morning they had seen the boys from the boys' school complaining about having to come to this event, this feminazi bitch coming to tell us why she hates men, I think were their exact words. And the girls hadn't done what I think perhaps would have occurred to me, which would have been to tell a teacher about what had happened. What they had done instead, together collectively, was they'd asked to leave their last lesson before this lecture a few minutes early. They turned up to the theatre before the boys' school arrived, and they had spread themselves out and seated themselves in every other seat throughout the entire auditorium, which was so much more effective than telling a teacher. And when these boys arrived, every single one of them had to sit in between two girls. And they couldn't have a kind of dissenting block.
Yes.
Like, I know it's a really tiny thing, but actually it was significant for me because it totally turned on its head the idea of how we respond to different crises, how we respond to hatred and abuse on social media in a real life space in a way that was incredibly effective. And we had one of the best conversations that day because, of course, once they started listening and were able to be open to a vulnerable and a difficult conversation, which boys absolutely are, if you can sit with them and make the space for it and approach it in the right way, it was brilliant. And we had a brilliant, constructive, powerful conversation. So I think that learning those powerful lessons from real life interactions 100%. Can be so important.
Reverence, word of mouth, talking, laughing, localize, like what happened around the corner, how did that person combat it?
Yes, exactly. I was in a school recently where one of the parents, talked about crowdsourcing male role models. And I was like, what a great idea. They were talking about the fact that, so in the kind of public maelstrom of public panic after adolescence, aired, that there's been this kind of panic around role models, and a recent study found that boys in the UK are more likely to have a mobile phone than to live with their dads. And these parents were talking about crowdsourcing male role models and sharing, like basically dads who are really great at one particular conversation, chatting with all of them, like inviting each other around and like dealing with this as a community, as a village. Yeah. And there's this fear and this panic and this idea that there is something fundamentally malfunctioned about teenage boys that's broken and it can't be fixed. And it's nonsense. And there's this idea that there are no good male role models. There's this panic that people are going to Andrew Tate because of a vacuum, which is absolute nonsense. Kids are going to Andrew Tate because of the algorithms. That is the answer. It's the algorithms. It's not him. He's not saying anything new. It's not a lack of great role models. There are amazing guys talking about this, cool young guys that boys want to listen to. You've got musicians like Jordan Stevens. You've got footballers like Hector Bellerin. You've got guys coming out of your ears talking about it, but they haven't got the algorithm power that Andrew Tate's got behind him. That's what's going on. But it also overlooks the potential power of male role models in boys' own lives. That's who boys really want to hear from and who have the real power to make a difference here. It's not just dads. This idea that like there's a panic if a boy doesn't have a father figure in his life. It's about sports coaches. It's about teachers. It's about uncles and brothers and cousins. It's about youth leaders and community leaders and church leaders. These men have so much power that they can leverage in positive, supportive conversations with boys that can have a transformative effect. And there are so many boys who are open to those chats as well. There's this unnuanced idea that all boys have been radicalized. It's a disaster. The train has left the station. That's not what we're seeing in schools. We're seeing such a mixed picture. There is a small group of boys, a minority of boys, I would say, who have been radicalized. There's a bigger cohort who have come into contact with some of these ideas further downstream, if you like, online, on more mainstream social media, on YouTube viral videos, on kind of Instagram memes and TikTok things and kind of cultural touch points and maybe over gaming chat rooms or bodybuilding forums. But there's also a group of boys who really do not want to be associated with this stuff. I was in a school recently and this little knot of boys waited till the end of my talk and I thought, I wonder what they're going to say. They came over and they said, we just wanted to ask you. And they were kind of nudging each other like, you say it, no, you say it. And then one of them went, we were thinking about joining a feminist society or like maybe making a feminist society and we just wanted to ask. And then they all kind of paused and one of them went, are we allowed? Yeah. And it's the best thing. You know, there is that there as well. There is so much hope. It is not a single black and white picture out there at all. And this stuff can be disrupted. We know it can. We have really good evidence from other forms of radicalization that it is possible to walk stuff back, that it all starts with communication. But we also know that it is a costly, lengthy, intense process to do that, and that by far the more effective, cost-effective, best solution is prevention. So we've got to start young. We've got to be talking about primary school. We've got to be talking about beyond just talking to kids about consent and gender stereotypes and healthy relationships and sexism, about things like media literacy, about online literacy, about internet skills, about recognizing source skepticism. There is so much that we could give young people from a much younger age.
Read a book?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. This is absolutely connected to the literacy crisis that we're seeing in schools. It's one of those very big, complex system problems with a big, complex system solution, and people hate that. They just want you to say, if you can find these 3 emojis on your child's post, that proves that they're in it. That's bollocks. It's not about the emojis. That's not what we're seeing.
I've got a bit of time to hand it over to you. Do you have any questions for us, please? Hello. We'll get around as many as we can. We've got to talk very quick.
You mentioned revolution, but the solutions and the things you're saying sound like renaissance. So is it revolution or renaissance or both?
Oh, good question.
I like both. I like renaissance a lot. Yeah, because that would offer reverence to those that have done this before us, you know, which I'm very much trying to do. It's a practice of reverence. I'm not the original. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
I love that idea. I think maybe it's a renaissance of culture and community and a revolution of the system within which that takes place.
You mentioned communication. The word communication comes from a Latin word, communicare, which is literally about being able to share within community. That's where it stems from. And that's when I really realized the power that I had being a trained communicator. That's who I am. That's my purpose, yeah.
Hi. Thank you, both of you. I hope that this doesn't bring down the conversation even more. But I have been quite concerned about what is often known as the Nordic paradox, which is that, you know, the highest rates of murder, say, might be in countries, I think maybe in South Africa is one of them, but the highest rates of killing of women where I'm saying this so inelegantly, basically the countries where the people who are killed the most are women are in the countries where they have the highest amount of equality. So in places like Latvia, in the countries that we often hail as having, you know, real systems of equality in terms of pay, in terms of all of this. And it seems like there's been research that shows very recently that there is a correlation between a very high level of equality and a high level of backlash in those communities where people don't have the same access to that. And so my question is about whether this is about something deeper, about ideas around dominance. We have and sorry, I'll be as quick as I can, but we have a society that on the one hand is advocating for feminism, and I'm a feminist obviously. On the other hand, we're still rewarding dominance. We're still expecting men to think that dominance and dominating and being on top is a valuable thing. And you cannot literally have the two exist. And we haven't done anything to address that tension. And I think that in a world where we move towards equality and we don't tell men that there is a place for them there and we don't get rid of the idea that dominance is a virtue, you create this inconsistency that we see carrying on because there's an existential thing to it where you start to wonder whether you have a place in society. And so I wonder what you think about how we address that and whether we want to look at a more almost existential crisis underneath this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really, really good point, and it is a huge issue. There is no country globally that has dealt with these issues. There is no country globally that has eradicated male violence against women, so nobody has perfected it without leaving those trailing tendrils behind, exactly as you say. And I know that we see this huge backlash against the perception of societal progress when women seem to be getting stronger, when they seem to be rising. There is this very real attempt to claw them back down into putting them back into their place and where they belong. And this is the wording of white supremacists. This is the wording of male supremacists, right? This is their raison d'etre. This is their everything. It's the birth rates. They are obsessed with this idea of women as breeding machines to be forced into a kind of sexual subjugation. The problem that incels have isn't with women being allowed to have sex, it's women being allowed to choose who to have sex with. And once you understand that, you start to understand how these two systems of world domination fit together. So I think for me, the answer to your question is that it is about how we create meaningful cultural shift in our narratives about who we are, what our place is within society, alongside systemic institutional shift. If you miss either one of those parts out, then it doesn't work, just as you've described. So, you know, it is and has been for a long time illegal to discriminate against someone because they have a baby in this country, but we still have extremely dominant cultural attitudes. Well, why should my company pay for a woman to go off and get pregnant? As a result, 54,000 women a year lose their jobs to maternity discrimination. You can't fix the system if you don't fix the cultural communication as well. So I think it's about trying to bring both of those two things along with us.
Can you do that to a beat next time? Because it's like so good.
Yeah, Richard Rees, I wanted to ask the question about equality because it's often misunderstood what we mean by equality. It's not treating everyone the same if we're starting from different places, and women around the world, because of misogyny and so on, are starting from a different place. Two things. One of the answers is male allies, but doing that, you have to challenge your inner misogynist, and we need to create ways of doing that. And some ideas you've said. Have you other ideas about how we can get young men and older men, actually, because older men are part of this? Second thing, we've got an election on Thursday. Two of the main parties are against human rights. Right? This is quite a crisis. The Conservatives and Reform treat equality. They want to get rid of the entire Equality Act and say everyone's the same. Trump says the same thing. Everyone's the same. I'm the same as a billionaire as the person in the ghetto or was poor. It's just nonsense. And so how do we reclaim equality as something that is actually a progressive force?
Great question. A difficult one to answer, I think.
We only have a few minutes as well, so you're going to have to talk even quicker.
I think it is a huge issue. I think certainly, with regards to your second point, it is a really difficult issue that left-wing communities and organisations are grappling with. How do we provide a narrative, a coherent narrative that is as appealing and as effective in appealing to masses of voters and of individuals as that populist, right-wing, individualist, racist, white supremacist narrative? It's not something that we're good at, but it's also, again, somewhere where the algorithms aren't doing us any favour. I think where I'm perhaps on ground that is more in my wheelhouse is thinking about your earlier question about how we encourage men and boys to feel able to explore those alternative forms of masculinity. And this very much comes back to exploding those gender stereotypes. When I'm working in schools, I give young people different pictures on the screen and I ask them to show which they'd gravitate towards. And there'll be all different things. Some of them will be items of clothing, some of them will be children's books, some of them will be television shows, some of them will be magazines. And universally what we see is that there is general tendency for them to separate along extreme stereotypical lines. But what you will sometimes see is girls, in a socially acceptable way, feeling able to go over and select the things that are culturally boy-coded. What happens much more rarely is boys being able to step out of that box and say, I read the fairy books. And when they do, ultimately derision always comes out. There's always laughter, there's always jeering. So I think that part of this is about giving boys space, and again, this work has to start from primary school, it has to be going right back to the beginning, to say, how do I actually want to express myself? What hobbies am I actually interested in beyond the blue toy store shelf that has told me that it's football and it's dressing up as a doctor and it's boxing and it's physical things and it's engineering, and that anything beyond that is completely socially unacceptable for me. And if we start there and then we add in the really powerful male role models, giving them opportunities to think about different options of expanding out of that later on, when they've already got those pathways that are a little bit, well, better trodden, then I think we start creating capacity for some really robust conversations about what masculinity can become and can look like. But I do think that that is work that needs to be spearheaded by men themselves and by male role models supporting boys. Whew!
Renaissance! Can you spud me? We love you. How can we nourish you? Because you do a lot. Like, we need to sign up to stuff. We need to buy your book outside. This is the moment.
At the moment, I mean, 5 years ago, I wrote a book called Men Who Hate Women, which was about a crisis that I felt wasn't being seen or talked about. And it's 5 years later now, almost exactly, and people are talking about it. I have a book that's about to come out next month that does exactly the same thing. It's a crisis that people aren't talking about, and there is this narrow moment of opportunity. It's about the ways in which AI and emerging technologies are entirely reinventing misogyny. They're not just replicating it. They're not even just building it into the very foundations of the society that we will all have no choice about living in. They're exacerbating it. They are worsening it. It is worse and more extreme, and it's not just misogyny. It's about all forms of inequality. It's about racism being reproduced and repackaged and spewed out at us stronger and less escapable. And it is about trying to shout together with that collective voice about this particular issue to policymakers.
So we need to ask our independent bookshops to get it.
Yeah,
we can get it
I think
now.
there's a QR code on the bookshop thing here for people who would like to order it.
In school libraries, primary school libraries, perhaps.
Maybe not the book in the kids' library, but for teachers and educators, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. And if we're doing that, then definitely, if you're interested in the weird opera, come on into the party. It's just sisterhood.live, and you can sign up and all the updates. Hopefully, we will come to a place near you, and the book's out next year. I also wrote a book for young people called Open, nearly 8 years ago now, which I will be signing in the foyer next to this incredible person. It's been lovely to have your eyes, your ears, your hearts, your nodding, and come speak to us afterwards and get in the queue and support women writers. We really do need you, especially one that works for the BBC and didn't have a contract for maternity leave. So yeah, let's support one another. Let's get together. Let's go to our primary schools and maybe not give them the book for the library, but at least start the conversations. And let's just be kind and compassionate. Thank you. And thank you to Westminster University. Thank you to everyone online. Thank you, B. Thank you, Mary Wollstonecraft. Okay, I said it wrong, Wollstonecraft. There we go. Nearly right? I got to get that right before the book comes out. Thank you so much. Thank you.